Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is December 1st, 2023, Friday, December 1st, 2023. And our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Beware Curbside Treasures. Have you ever driven by furnishings and belongings left at the curbside which seem too good to be true? Why would anyone give these things away for free, you ask yourself? If you knew the answer, you would peel out and just watch the items grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Lastly, you would sigh in relief. The first item is titled The Lady in the Turban. In 2018, Mel Hamilton found the painting of a woman with a turban next to a commercial bin on a Brighton street. This is in United Kingdom. It had a broken frame, which she assumed was the reason why it was thrown out. She soon came to suspect that it had been discarded for darker reasons. She reframed it, and everything in her life took a turn for the worse. Mel left with her clothes, her dog, and the painting when her relationship with her partner ended. At that point, she was so drawn to it, the it being the painting, she decided not to leave it behind. It was signed with what appears to be the name Shoanziza Ekeli and the date 1973. This might possibly be a Nigerian name. Soon after moving into a new apartment, her old but healthy German Shepherd dog died unexpectedly. That's when she started to experience the dark and unexplainable activity that would haunt her for 3 years. Doors would open and shut by themselves. The TV would change channels without the aid of a human. Once she awoke when she heard the jingling of keys opening her door. She said, "I would hear the door handles move and the keys go in and out. This overwhelming darkness was awful, and I was alone. It very quickly became apparent that something was amiss. Everything was going wrong. Everything." Plants and flowers would die soon after she brought them home. She came to believe a dark entity had attached itself to her when she was the most vulnerable. She was battling alcoholism, and when she tried to tell others of her experience, they dismissed it as her being drunk. She lived in Ramsgate and said, "Things got really unbearable. There was so much activity that I didn't want to live there. The energy in it was just so bad and so dark. I was a nervous wreck and covered in crosses. I went to a meeting and tried to sound rational, but nobody believed me." 3 years later, her son threw the portrait out and the ill fortune stopped. She became sober, started a relationship with a new man, and felt comfortable in her home. The conclusion was inevitable. The harbinger of the dark activity was the portrait. Second item, it's called the Captain's Portrait. Like many haunted places, especially those visited by the public, it's only after hours that the unusual starts to occur. Such is the case at the Corned Beef and Company in Roanoke, Virginia. The source of the disturbances, according to the employees, is a portrait of Captain Andrew McKeever. Present day, the warnings are heeded. So the picture is only dusted but never moved. Why? Because if you do, then the ghost will start following you around. Some believe just being around the portrait will provoke the captain. He flicks lights on and off. Others have heard the activity in the billiard room when the restaurant is closed. Voices heard in another room, and their name being whispered. The general manager said, "A girl that was hanging Christmas lights around the captain, she actually touched the painting. She cut her hand pretty bad that day at corned beef. The people that touched it and tried to clean it, they saw shadows walking around. Things would get knocked off the countertops." Captain McKeever was a World War I Canadian two-seater flying ace who, in conjunction with his gunners, was credited with 31 victories. All but two of those triumphs were over German Albatross DV fighters. Once the war ended, he wanted to stay close to his passion, and he accepted a job as a manager for an airfield at Mineola, New York. Ironically, after so many close calls during wartime, before he could start work, he was involved in an auto accident in his hometown of Listowel. He broke his leg. Complications set in, and he died of cerebral thrombosis on Christmas Day 1919. He was 26 years old. The next item is titled The Two Dolls. In March 2022, a painting of two dolls was posted on eBay. Like many similar items, they're put for sale either for the notoriety or fear. The man who bought it said the item ruined his life. Using the pseudonym of Dan Smith, he describes himself as a collector of weird things. And a visit to a flea market is when he came across the innocuous-looking painting. The woman who was selling it warned him away. Either she wanted a clear conscience, or she used the oldest but best sales pitch to use on collectors. It worked, and he bought the painting. His description on eBay was, quote, "Beware cursed vintage painting dolls, art creepy, eerie warning 1967. The woman at the flea market warned me before buying this, and I will warn you. No good can come from this painting. I didn't think much of it at the time and just assumed she was one of those oddball dealers hawking their wares for cheap. As for the painting, it looks adorable, with the two innocent seeming dolls portrayed in it. But she was right, don't be deceived. I don't know whose cursed blood was mixed in with the paint to create this piece, but its powers are strong." End quote of the listing on eBay. Once he got the painting home, he was visited by biblical type manifestations. He had an insect infection, his once healthy hamster died, and he lost sleep. He suffered from sickness, loneliness, sleeplessness, and uneasiness, and believes that the only recourse left to him was to get rid of the creepy picture. He noted the only difference in his life before it took such a dark turn was the purchase of the painting. He said he didn't destroy it, for instance with fire, but he feared it could easily unleash the evil and make things 10 times worse. He didn't want to risk this, but instead decided to sell it to someone who doesn't believe in curses, or someone who does but is attracted to it just the way he was. Further information on the listing was, quote, "For the details on the piece, it comes with a frame. It is dusty since I never got around to cleaning it off after hanging it. As for the artist, it is signed with the initials M and P 367. Of course, that could also just stand for something like many nightmares and phobias, which is what the artwork leads to. I'm starting the auction at $50, which is what I paid for, but I am hoping it goes for more to make up for everything I've been through. But before you bid, you've been warned." That's the end of the listing. Now, lest you think your chances of buying a creepy painting off eBay is lost, fear not, these were offered in September of 2023. So as of, a couple of months ago, these were up for sale in eBay. And for those of you who are watching the video version of this, this is what this listing, this is a painting of a little rag doll on the floor. And this is what the listing says. This very sweet original Sherry Roop watercolor was painted for a little girl named Abby. Abigail Jean Roop, 1977 to 2015. The doll was made for her by her mother or grandmother as a Christmas gift in 1979. The painting was done in 1981 and at some point entered into a gallery or fair. The tag for entry is still attached and the back is beautifully inscribed. There you go. So let's go to the next painting. Next one, the listing reads, "This painting is signed BAHA and is dated 10/4/77 as on October 4th, 1977. There's a demonic feel and look to this painting. It has a depressed feeling as if the women's faces and bodies that are painting are trapped inside the windows of this house. They can only stare out, but no one notices them. It is a dark and gloomy painting." There you go. And then the third one, there's an older lady in the painting, the listing read, "This is a painting that I purchased from a peddler's mall. As soon as I seen it, there was just something about it that kept drawing me to it. Since owning it, I've experienced disembodied footsteps, voices, and things getting moved. I've had things thrown and my cat getting spooked. I've tried to find any information about the painting or the artist, but I haven't been able to find anything." And again, by the way, I looked at these paintings, there's nothing attractive to them, but I'm thinking to myself, aesthetically, I don't find any of them attractive, but that's just me. But after that, who would want to own one of these things? Again, that's just me. The next story is out of CBS News and it's titled "Viking Ship Remnants Unearthed at Burial Mound, where seated skeleton and sword were previously found." Archaeologists in Norway recently unearthed the remains of a Viking ship at a burial mound in the country's Trondelag region. The discovery comes centuries after a seated skeleton and a sword were found at the same site. The discovery was announced on social media by Trondelag County and was made by researchers from the county and the nation's NTNU Science Museum. The archaeologists were conducting a small survey at the burial mound named Herlagshaugen, where they found large nails that the county said confirmed it was a site of a Viking ship. The ship is from the Merovingian era. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation, which lasted from 476 AD until 750 AD, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Gemini, a Scandinavian science and technology publication, said that the ship was built in approximately 700 AD and noted that the Merovingian era precedes the Viking era. Ships' burials were reserved for individuals because it was believed they offered safe passage to the afterlife. The ship isn't the only major find to have been turned up at her Logenshagen. The burial mound is over 196 feet long, according to Gemini, and was excavated multiple times in the 18th century. In that era, researchers discovered iron nails, a bronze cauldron, animal bones, and a seated skeleton with a sword. According to Gemini, Norwegian sagas suggest that Herlogshagen could be the burial place of King Herlog. The skeleton was displayed at a museum as that of Herlog, Gemini reported, but eventually disappeared. The other items also vanished as of the early 1920s, with Gemini reporting that the bronze cauldron was said to have been melted down into shoe buckles. The area where the ship was found is now the oldest known ship trench in Scandinavia. The county said. Gemini noted that this means ship burials occurred far earlier than researchers previously believed. Geir Gronsby, a researcher at the NTNU Science Museum, said that dating the ship back that far shows that people had maritime expertise and could build large ships much earlier than previously thought. In 2020, a large Viking burial site was discovered by a Norwegian archaeologist. The site was in the southeastern part of the county and Gjelstad's Gjelestads, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these foreign names. Wow. Gelman Mound. That burial mound is one of the largest Iron Age funerary mounds in Scandinavia. The mound has been used for centuries, possibly beginning in the 5th century, but the ship itself appeared to have been buried centuries later. And I think what's interesting about these stories is, for years, all these academics had put, all these, years. These were the years that this culture or whatever was doing this. And they keep having to pull that year back. In other words, shipbuilding, ship travel, even architecture is dating back sometimes hundreds or thousands of years earlier, which, again, and I've mentioned this before, sometimes history, I think, has to be revisited as far as historically what cultures were doing and who went where at what time, because I think a lot of that was out there, is not entirely accurate. And as for that they've lost track of what was unearthed back in the 18th century, I've come across so many stories of this type where things are found like 1800s, early 1900s, mostly in the 1800s or earlier, and they lose track of them. And it's incredible. Sometimes they don't if they're given to a museum. So I'm hoping that some of this stuff just ended up in somebody's private collection. But it would, after going through all that trouble, some of these things are like one of a kind that they would lose track of them altogether. But there you go with that. All right, let's go back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. And this is a story called The Ghost of Lady Anne. It's not hard to believe a woman who started out as a mistress, became the wife, and was ultimately killed by her husband does not lie easy in her grave. The lady's name is Anne Boleyn. Anne was born in an old medieval manor around 1500. Her great-grandfather, Sir Geoffrey Boleyn, bought the Tudor house in 1452. A structure had been erected there since the time of Edward the Confessor on 6,000 acres of land. About 100 years later, Sir Henry Hobart built Blickling Hall in Norfolk on the site of the old manor house. Anne's shade has been seen throughout the years, and May 19th, when she met her death in the Tower of London in 1536, is the most common date of her sighting. On the National Trust website, her appearance is described thus, quote, "As night falls, Anne Boleyn's ghost rides up to the house in a coach drawn by a headless horseman, with her own head on her lap. The moment the coach arrives in front of the house, it vanishes into thin air. Tradition also has it that when news of Anne's death reached Blickling Hall in 1536, 4 headless horses were seen dragging the body of a headless man across Norfolk." And that was the end of the reference from the National Trust website. Blickling Hall is also haunted by Anne's father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, who lost two children to Henry's executioner. Sir Henry Hobart, who built Blickling, is another ghost who makes his presence known on the anniversary of his death by groaning from the west turret bedroom. Henry VIII seemed especially attracted to the Boleyn women. He was involved with Anne's sister Mary, and according to Sir George Throckmorton, he was involved also with Elizabeth Boleyn, their mother, even though Henry denied the relationship with Elizabeth. Mary Boleyn became Henry's mistress even though she was married to a courtier named William Carey. It was rumored that one or both of her children were fathered by Henry. 2 years after Mary's marriage in 1520, Anne returned from the French court, where it was rumored she was engaged in many sexual liaisons, and the French king referred to her as the English mare. Anne joined the royal court as one of Queen Catherine of Aragon's maids of honor. By 1526, Henry was in pursuit of Anne. However, she refused to become his mistress. This propelled him to seek an annulment from his queen. Anne was crowned Queen of England in June 1533 and gave birth to Princess Elizabeth on September 7, 1533. Despite all the charges used to bring about Anne Boleyn's fate, it seemed the failure to produce a male heir for the crown was her undoing. Not that it did her much good, but according to Tudor expert Sandra Vasoli, evidence has been unearthed that Henry expressed regret of his hand in Anne's death. A message read, quote, "The king acknowledges with great grief at his death the injuries he had done to Lady Anne Boleyn and her daughter." End quote. The originator of the writing was a Franciscan friar, André Thevet, who lived at the friary attached to Greenwich Palace. He would have been 32 years old when Henry VIII died. He regularly heard the confessions of English courtiers. Henry's true love, though, was thought to be Catherine of Aragon, whose failure to produce a male heir propelled him to set her aside, even though the annulment he sought was never recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. Ironically, Catherine died 6 months before Anne's execution. Anne was never accepted by the common people. They considered her a prostitute and called her, quote, "the great whore." She was detested because Catherine of Aragon had been so loved, and they blamed her for alienating the king's affection. According to Sylvia Soberton, Elizabeth Holland, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, probably stayed with her at the Tower during her incarceration. Bessie Holland was present during Anne's coronation. She was also the mistress of the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle, which also explains how she was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Later she married Henry Reps and became known as Elizabeth Reps. Anne also had confidants, which turned out to be spying on her while she was imprisoned in the Tower. Soberton said 4 women attending Anne would pass information on to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower. The women were Mary Kingston's wife, Margaret Coffin, wife of Anne's Master of the Horse, Lady Boleyn, Anne's aunt, and Mrs. Stoner, who may have been in charge of the behavior of the maids of honor. Even if Anne suspected that these women were spying on her, she talked frequently about subjects which led to the arrest of 5 men and strengthened the charges against her. On May Day, Anne visited Greenwich with Henry to watch a tilting match. The next day she, along with others, were arrested on a charge of treason. She was beheaded 17 days later. Anne's ghost has been seen in different places, starting with Blickling Hall, her birthplace, Hever Castle, her childhood home, Hampton Court, Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, Sal Church, where her body was allegedly moved to after her original burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London. Supposedly she was buried in secret under a black slab near where her Boleyn ancestors lay in repose, and Marwell Hall, where the Seymours lived between 1530 to 1638. Marwell Hall at the Yew Tree Walk is where Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, her rival, strolled while she was being held at the Tower of London. Henry wed Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution. At Hampton Court, she is seen wearing a blue dress. This is the same place Jane Seymour died 15 months after her marriage, and just a few days after she gave birth to Prince Edward. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, who also met the executioner by Henry's order, is said to haunt Hampton Court. Anne's ghost has been seen standing at a window in the Dean's Cloister at Windsor Castle. There she keeps company with her daughter Elizabeth I and Henry, both which have been heard and sighted. At Blickling Hall, it's not only Anne, but her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, who is seen being dragged by four headless horses. His headless apparition is seen wandering around the estate. In some stories, the driver of the coach that bring Anne to Blickling Hall is her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn. Once he drops her off, he continues on his way, pursued by screaming demons that curse him for his betrayal. He is forced to flee over 12 bridges that lie between Wroxham and Blickling for a millennium as a penance. Hever Castle, where Anne grew up, was built in the 13th century. When the Boleyn family bought the castle in the 16th century, they rebuilt much of the castle. Anne is seen every Christmas Eve crossing the bridge over the River Eden. She is also seen standing under the great oak where Henry wooed her. The Tower of London is Anne's favorite haunt. It is said it is a place soaked in suffering and blood, built by William the Conqueror in 1078. Anne has been seen in the White Tower, the Queen's House, Tower Green where the scaffold was erected, and the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Nicholas Sander, a recusant born in 1530, described Anne this way, quote, Anne Boleyn was rather tall of stature, with black hair and an oval face of sallow complexion, as if troubled with jaundice. She had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, and on her right hand 6 fingers. There was a large wen under her chin, and therefore, to hide its ugliness, she wore a high collar covering her throat. In this she was followed by the ladies of court, who also wore high dresses, having before been in the habit of leaving their necks and upper portion of their persons uncovered. She was handsome to look at, with a pretty mouth. End quote. In 1817, a sentry at the White Tower died from a heart attack after seeing the ghost of Anne Boleyn on a staircase. In 1864, a guard outside the Queen's house saw a woman in white, veiled in mist. She wore a gown from Tudor times and a French hood, but she had no face. He challenged the figure, which turned toward him. He thrust forward with his bayonet, and it passed through the figure. He fainted. Later he was court-martialed for falling asleep during his watch. However, he was found not guilty when other eyewitnesses said they had seen the headless woman on Tower Green that same night. An officer saw the form from a window in the Bloody Tower, and he heard the sentry yelling and saw him thrust his bayonet through the misty figure. The ghost passed through the bayonet and the sentry himself. In the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne is supposedly buried, at another sighting in 1882, a captain of the guard saw a light burning in the locked chapel. It was very late at night. He found a ladder and looked in through the chapel window. He described it thus, quote, slowly down the aisle moved a stately procession of knights and ladies, attired in ancient costumes, and in front walked an elegant female whose face was averted from him, but whose figure greatly resembled the one he had seen in reputed portraits of Anne Boleyn. After having repeatedly paced the chapel, the entire procession, together with the light, disappeared. End quote. In 1929, Anne Boleyn's shade was reported at a new golf course in London. She was said to be along Boleyn Walk, a long avenue adjoining the 16th and 17th fairways. This route led to the old hunting lodge. She was seen in the shade of the trees even in daytime. Once this place was the bishop's palace, which was a favorite hunting ground of Henry VIII. The ruins of his hunting lodge joined one of the trees. The ruins of his hunting lodge adjoined one of the trees on the new course. Located in Surrey, the course was the Addington Palace Golf Club. It was built in 1772 by Alderman Tredthick and Lord Mayor of London. However, the site once had another house owned by the family of Legge, built during Norman times. In 1807, the manor and lands were bought for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and for more than 100 years the archbishops lived there, and 5 of them were buried in the park. In 1907, the palace and 1,200 acres were bought by the late Mr. English, a South African millionaire. He improved it, and an architect was converting the building to a clubhouse, including a conversion of the chapel, which he stated had never been consecrated, into a dining room. It's believed that charges against Anne Boleyn were manufactured in order for Henry to marry Jane Seymour. Many believe she would have been too worldly to risk her position as queen and the paternity of any heir she could produce, including the Princess Elizabeth, by being unfaithful. But perhaps Anne faced a dire problem that forced her to take a lover, spurred by expediency. Henry, once fit, was in his mid-40s during a time when the average lifespan was 35 years of age. By the time of their marriage, Henry was not the man he used to be. In 1527 he injured his foot, and the same year he suffered from a sore leg. This is believed to be the first time a reference was made to an ulcerated wound on his thigh. In January 1536, he was unseated during a joust and the horse landed on top of him. He was unconscious for 2 hours and his legs were hurt, possibly fractured. Anne miscarried a pregnancy shortly after the incident. This was the third pregnancy she lost. Henry suffered from headaches after the head injury, and his behavior deteriorated. The painful wound in his thigh returned. The ulcers were purulent and seeped. He had also gained a lot of weight. Perhaps visits from Henry to Anne's bed were few and far between. George Bernard, a history professor at Southampton University, examined a poem written in 1545, 9 years after Anne's execution. It was written by Lancelot de Carles, the French ambassador to Henry's court. It is titled, quote, "A letter containing the criminal charges laid against Queen Anne Boleyn of England," end quote, and suggests she was guilty of adultery after all. It describes where Anne was said to despise her marriage and had malice against the king. The indictment said that by base conversations and kisses, touching gifts, and other famous incitations, she seduced men. Mark Smeaton, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and Sir William Brereton were accused of adultery along with Anne's brother George. According to Bernard, the poem indicates that Anne's indiscretions were revealed after an argument between a privy councillor and his sister, who he accused of promiscuity. She pointed out the queen was much worse, to a much higher fault that is much more damaging. The professor believes the woman was Elizabeth, Countess of Worcester. Comments and contemporary letters backed up the poem. The Countess was one of Anne Boleyn's ladies in her privy chamber. She testified against Anne Boleyn, claiming she engaged in several adulterous acts. Bernard said, "It's not that I've discovered the poem for the first time. It's been known to scholars because an edition was printed in the 20s. But on the whole, scholars have dismissed it because it's a literary source. But it seems to me that presents a plausible scenario. We can identify the accuser as the Countess of Worcester and we can link her to the Queen." Long before her arrest, Anne probably suspected only a pregnancy with a 50% chance of producing a male would assure her future as the Queen. Wherever the truth lies, if regrets are an ingredient for a haunting, Anne Boleyn has plenty to spare. And, you think of all these women, including an aunt, that were, what they call maids of honors or ladies in waiting, and even when she was incarcerated, and you would think, who would betray them? Think about it. Who's not going to betray her? Here is Henry VIII with Jane Seymour in the wings, and what he wants to do is he wants to get rid of his wife, and so he can marry very quickly, 11 days later, what a new queen, so he can have an heir. Do you think any of those women, when they were being questioned by whoever the spy master was, when what did she say, are going to, how can I say, cover or run interference for Anne Boleyn? Absolutely not. Because they were thinking, if he's ready to execute his own wife, he'll do the same for me if I don't go with the program. So, lest you think that some of these women, they did wrong by betraying her. Maybe they tried to, but let's face it, they probably wanted to keep their heads on their shoulders. Anyway, let's go on to the next story. The next story is out of the conversation and is titled, "Did Napoleon Really Fire at the Pyramids?" A historian explains the truth behind the legends of Ridley Scott's biopic, which, by the way, this is a new movie that was released about Napoleon, and I really haven't verified if it's historically accurate, if Ridley Scott produced a historically accurate version, but let's see. Directors of historical feature films face a difficult task. How can they make sure the character is familiar to an audience without reducing them to caricature? How can they make sure that knowledge of the outcome, battles won or lost, empires built and ruined, doesn't make the story seem like it's writing itself? Director Ridley Scott is not a historian and presumably wants to entertain rather than to enlighten, but the problem of historical truth is an interesting one. It is not easy to know the real Napoleon. There's a recognizable version of him, the confident general, beloved of his troops, the instinctive military tactician who could run on empty for days at a time, his stern and somewhat petulant gaze. But Much of this is the product of layers of historical storytelling accrued by the labor of generations of artists, journalists, and memorists, and of course, Napoleon himself. Abel Gance's spectacular silent film Napoleon, that was released in 1927, for example, charted the life and career of Napoleon up to his departure as a military general for the Italian campaign in 1796. In one scene, a heavy winter snowfall interrupts classes at Napoleon's military college. The boys run outside to play and inevitably start throwing snowballs at each other. The scene depicts a very young Napoleon emerging as a natural commander, directing the combat as though on the field of battle. Yet the veracity of this moment rests primarily on a single account, the memoir of one of Napoleon's childhood friends, Louis de Buren, who attended the same school. The author was later an employee of Napoleon, who sacked him for embezzlement in 1802. Many years later, in 1829, de Bournier penned a memoir in the hope of cashing in on the popular appetite for authentic tales of the great general. What we think we know about the real Napoleon is often filtered through self-interested and partial accounts like this one. Here are the facts and legends behind some of the major scenes from Ridley Scott's new Napoleon biopic. Question: did Napoleon crown himself? Napoleon went to great lengths to craft his image as a benign ruler and a man of the people, often enlisting the talents of artists to do so. Most notoriously, Jacques-Louis David was commissioned to produce a series of grand paintings depicting Napoleon's coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris, in December 1804. In the most famous, we see Napoleon place a crown on the head of the new Empress Josephine, while a reluctant Pope Pius VII looks on. In an astonishing act of hubris, Napoleon had indeed already placed a crown on his own head, though the oil painting shows him only in laurel leaves, to signify his martial triumphs. What Scott's film depicts is the magnificence of the oil painting, which showed Napoleon and his empress in the most flattering light, rather than the coronation ceremony itself. His relationship with Josephine. There is no doubt that Napoleon felt a deep passion for Marie-Joseph Rose de la Pagerie, known to him as Josephine, whom he married in 1796, as his military career was in the ascendant. Yet her depiction in Ridley Scott's film as a young seductress probably speaks more to sexist cliché than to Josephine's undoubted self-assuredness. She was 6 years older than Napoleon, a widow, and mother of 2 young children when they met, and the young general's romantic feelings were seemingly stronger than hers. While on campaign, he wrote to her virtually every day, his pen sometimes piercing the parchment, such was the force of his emotion. Yet some of these letters to remain unopened. The relationship was as tumultuous as it was passionate, and both spouses had several affairs. Yet when Napoleon instigated divorce in 1809 for want of an heir, it was surprisingly amicable. The Empress retained her imperial title until her death in 1814 and was permitted to continue living in the imperial Chateau de Malmaison. Was Napoleon present at the execution of Marie Antoinette? The autumn of 1793 was especially busy for Napoleon, given his increasingly important role in the siege of Toulon. Federalist rebels had handed over the French fleet to the British Admiral Samuel Hood, and the young artillery officer commanded the operation and eventually seized it back. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that he ventured to Paris in October to be among the crowd that witnessed the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette. In a letter to his older brother Joseph, however, Napoleon did claim to witness the storming of the Tuileries Palace by an angry crowd of Republican protesters in June 1792. It revolted him. Did Napoleon really fire at the pyramids? Napoleon began his Egyptian campaign in 1798. The cultural legacy of the campaign can be seen in the well-stocked Egyptology section of the Louvre, but it was also the scene of atrocities. At one point, several thousand Ottoman soldiers were shot or driven into the sea on Napoleon's orders rather than taken prisoner. You don't need to invent ice traps or Napoleon ordering his men to fire at the pyramids, as Ridley Scott's biopic does, to convey his callous disregard for life. It was the rumor that he had ordered his own plague-stricken troops to be poisoned in the town of Jaffa that finally tarnished Napoleon's reputation in the early 19th century. It stuck. No matter how brilliant the sanitizing riposte of the artist Antoine Jean Gros, whom Napoleon had commissioned in 1804 to paint a different story. Ridley Scott's film does not represent the past so much as carry versions of the tales and images depicting Napoleon that spun him into existence since his own lifetime, many of which were crafted by his own hand. So there you go. In other words, it kind of sounds like Ridley Scott. It looks like a nice film. I haven't seen it, but he really didn't explore it. It's really funny because Josephine, she was widowed by her husband being guillotined, and yeah, there's a lot more to it than I think that. And also, I don't agree with, you know, sensibilities, but I'm a product of the times I live in. But those Ottomans, they were savage themselves. They were no angels. I mean, I don't agree that he drove them into the sea, but they were no angels. Okay, back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. And the next one is the business of stolen body parts. Right? Did a robber who broke into a truck parked in Denver's Central Park neighborhood realize they were making off with human remains? In March 2022, a medical truck used to transport body parts for medical research was considered not the usual mark for thieves. What was taken was a white cardboard box measuring 20 by 15 by 18 inches, marked with Science Care on the exterior, which is a company that accepts bodies donated to science. There was another label, Exempt Human Specimen. Inside the box were human heads. The truck was bringing the specimens back to Science Care after a training event. The freight company had left the truck parked in the 7700 block of East 23rd Avenue, Denver. A dolly was also taken. Michael Berg, an attorney involved in cases related to human remains, said, quote, "Who has the heads? How did they get the heads? What was the purpose of getting the heads? And obviously they refused to talk to you." End quote. He pointed out donation of human remains is mostly unregulated, and it is a multi-billion-dollar business. He suggested donations should be made to a university instead of a private company. By donations, he means donations of human bodies. One could ask, why would anyone steal human heads? But the answer is quite simple. They are worth lots of money. A head with a brain, or cephalus, is priced at $500. With a spine, the price goes up to $850. And a torso with a head and should be about $3,500. In 2021, it's estimated that a skull with teeth would sell for about $1,200. Michael Berg said that body parts are brokered to companies across the country who are willing to pay for certain parts. Quote, "They sell the heads, arms, legs, hips, genitalia. We have discovered that many of these bodies are also sold to the Department of Defense and are blown up like crash test dummies." End quote. More than likely, whoever stole the box had a buyer waiting in the wings who was interested in this merchandise. The crime remains unsolved. In April 2023, a year after the heads were stolen, Candace Chapman Scott, 36, an ex-mortuary worker, was charged with selling stolen body parts for thousands of dollars. She sold 20 boxes of human remains to a man she met on a Facebook group about oddities. His name was Jeremy Pauley. Scott worked at a funeral home, Arkansas Central Mortuary Services, where she transported, cremated, and embalmed remains. University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences would send cadavers that had been donated to the funeral home for disposal. According to the indictment, for 9 months, Scott sold Pauley fetuses, brains, hearts, lungs, genitalia, large pieces of skin, and other body parts. Pauley sent Scott a payment of $1,600 via PayPal for 2 brains, 1 with skull cap, 3 hearts, 1 cut, 2 fake boobies, 1 large belly button, piece of skin, 1 arm, 1 huge piece of skin, and 1 lung. That's quoted directly from the listing. She would receive $10,975 via PayPal in 16 different transactions. Pennsylvania charged Pauley with the misdemeanor court of abuse of a corpse, a felony count of receiving stolen property, a misdemeanor count of receiving stolen property, and a felony count of dealing proceeds of unlawful activities. He posted bail and was released. Pauley operates the Memento Mori Museum and calls himself, quote, The lead preservationist specialist of retired medical specimens and curator to historic remains and artifacts, end quote. In September 2023, he pled guilty in federal court to trafficking in human remains. Yes, it's worth a lot of money, human remains. And the last story is out of NPR and is titled, "The Vatican Broadens Public Access to an Ancient Roman Necropolis." The Vatican is now making it easier for members of the general public to visit the Vatican necropolis, a Roman burial ground located a few feet beneath St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The more than 10,000 square foot site contains marble sarcophagi, tombs dating from between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, and Roman frescoes and mosaics. The Vatican is broadening access to the necropolis for its exhibition called Life and Death in the Rome of the Caesars, which opened Friday. And by Friday, I'm going to say this was about 3 weeks ago. The Vatican's museum did not immediately respond to NPR's request for more information. Speaking in a video, Vatican Museum Director Barbara Jatta said in the past, organized tours of the necropolis were generally only granted to approved groups of academics, students, and other specialists. Now, a gate overlooking Risorgimento Square has been opened along the Vatican's walls, enabling any ticket buyer to freely explore the site. The individual visitor can come without the help of a guide, Jatta said. They can grasp one of the world's most unique archaeological sites. The Vatican began excavating the necropolis in the 1950s. People who were enslaved are buried there. Some of them, we understood from the epigraphs, must have been imperial property because their master, the Emperor Nero, is often mentioned. Vatican Museum's archaeologist Leonardo de Blasi said, adding that the graves of artisans and other lower middle class Roman citizens employed by Nero have also been discovered at the site. The Vatican necropolis is located outside central Rome. Ancient Roman law forbade burials within city limits for the sake of safety and hygiene. In other words, they understood the idea of contamination, cholera, the water, your water sources, etc. All right, so here we go. I hope you liked that few stories of interesting, eerie, and weird news, and I will be back soon. I promise. As a matter of fact, that is one of my New Year's resolution for 2024 is to come back more often to Eerie News and bring you news locally and from around the world of the strange and the unusual. Until next time.